The grand ballroom shimmered with a cold perfection that felt more like a corporate showcase than a wedding celebration. Crystal chandeliers cast sharp, brilliant light across a sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, each guest strategically placed for maximum social advantage. At the center of this opulent stage stood David Sterling, his smile as polished and impersonal as the marble floors beneath his feet. Today marked the culmination of his carefully constructed life, a merger of fortunes disguised as a marriage. Victoria represented the final piece in his empire's expansion, a transaction wrapped in white lace and empty vows. He adjusted his tie, the silk feeling like a noose he'd tied himself. Every detail was flawless, yet he felt nothing but the profound emptiness that had haunted him for years. The ghost of a different life, one he had deliberately destroyed, lingered just beyond the periphery of his consciousness, waiting for the perfect moment to shatter his carefully curated reality. 5 years earlier, the heart of David's empire wasn't a boardroom, but a kitchen, a stainless steel battlefield where heat, pressure, and artistry collided. Sterling's, his flagship restaurant, was a temple of gastronomy where the wealthy paid obscene amounts for the privilege of being served perfection. And perfection was precisely what Marcus Chun delivered night after night. His station was a study in controlled chaos, every movement economical, every ingredient treated with reverence. Where other chefs shouted and threw pans, Marcus worked with a quiet intensity that commanded respect. He was an artist, and the plate was his canvas. David Sterling saw it differently. To him, the kitchen was just another profit center, the staff interchangeable parts in a machine designed to generate revenue. He would make his weekly inspections, his Italian loafers silent on the non-slip flooring, his eyes missing the artistry and seeing only the bottom line. He viewed Marcus's quiet dedication as a lack of ambition, his passion for food as a distraction from efficiency. David preferred the louder, more obsequious chefs who understood the hierarchy. Marcus understood only the craft. The tension was a constant hum beneath the kitchen's roar. David would critique a dish, not for its flavor balance, but for the cost of its saffron threads. He'd question the labor-intensive technique behind Marcus's signature broth, suggesting a powdered base would shave precious minutes off the ticket time. Marcus would simply nod, his dark eyes revealing nothing, and continue his work with the same meticulous care. His dignity was a quiet rebellion against David's cold calculus. The other kitchen staff watched this silent war with bated breath. They knew Marcus was the backbone of the kitchen, the one who could elevate simple ingredients into something transcendent. They also knew David saw that talent as a threat, something he couldn't fully control or quantify. The atmosphere grew more oppressive with each of David's visits, the air thick with the unspoken understanding that a clash was inevitable. Marcus, aware of the target on his back, poured everything into his work. His cooking was his identity, his heritage, his only defense against the dehumanizing gaze of the man who signed his paychecks. He was building something beautiful within the gilded cage David had constructed, unaware that the door was about to be slammed shut. The breaking point came disguised as opportunity. A notoriously difficult food critic, known for making or breaking careers with a single review, had booked a table. The entire staff was on edge. David micromanaged every detail, his anxiety manifesting as increased cruelty. He snapped at a dishwasher for a water spot on a glass, berated a sommelier for a half-second hesitation. But his focus was squarely on Marcus. He lingered by the sauté station, his presence a dark cloud. "This had better be flawless, Chun," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. "No room for your creative interpretations tonight. Stick to the script." Marcus didn't respond. He simply focused on the seared scallops in his pan, achieving a caramelized crust that was textbook perfection. The critic's order came in, the tasting menu. The kitchen moved like a well-oiled machine, each course meeting David's exacting, soulless standards. Then came the main event. Marcus's signature dish, a tea-smoked duck breast with a ginger plum gastrique. It was a masterpiece of texture and flavor, a dish that spoke of hours of patient preparation. As Marcus placed the final garnish, a single microgreen, his hand was steady. This was his worth, expressed on a plate. He sent it out, a silent prayer on his lips. The moment of truth had arrived, but the betrayal would come from an entirely unexpected direction. Have you ever been underestimated because of your passion? Share your story in the comments. The confrontation is coming. Subscribe so you don't miss the moment everything shatters. The kitchen held its collective breath as the runner returned from the dining room. The critic had finished the duck. The response was not a compliment or a complaint, but a summons. David was wanted at the critics' table. A slow smirk spread across David's face. This was it, the validation he craved. He straightened his suit jacket and strode out of the kitchen, the picture of confident success. 10 minutes later, he returned. The smirk was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fury that seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. He walked directly to Marcus's station, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. He didn't shout. His voice was dangerously quiet, each word a shard of ice. "The duck was inedible," David said, his eyes locked on Marcus. A hair, a long, dark hair, found nestled in the gas streak. A wave of disbelief washed through the kitchen. Marcus was fanatical about hygiene, his station immaculate, his hair always secured under a cap. It was impossible. "The review will be a slaughter," David continued, his voice rising. "This embarrassment falls on you, Chun. Your carelessness has cost this restaurant its reputation." Marcus stood frozen, the accusation so absurd it felt surreal. He looked at his colleagues, their faces a mixture of shock and pity. He saw the truth then, reflected in their eyes. This wasn't an accident. This was a pretext. "You're fired," David declared, the words ringing in the hushed kitchen. "Clean out your station. Get out of my restaurant." There was no investigation, no chance to defend himself. The verdict was delivered with finality. Marcus slowly removed his chef's jacket, the white fabric emblazoned with the Sterling's logo. He folded it neatly, placing on the stainless steel counter. The act was one of profound dignity in the face of utter humiliation. He didn't look at David as he walked out, his head held high. He passed his colleagues, their eyes downcast, and pushed through the double doors into the alley, the cold night air hitting him like a physical blow. The gilded kitchen had shown its true worth, and it was far less than his own. The alley behind Sterling's was a different world, damp concrete, overflowing dumpsters, the distant wail of sirens replacing the kitchen's frantic symphony. Marcus stood there, the cold seeping through his chef's pants, the weight of what just happened crashing down. The humiliation wasn't in the firing itself. It was in the method. The lie was so flimsy, so transparent, that its only purpose could have been to degrade him. David hadn't just ended his employment. He had tried to strip him of his professional integrity, the one thing he owned outright. He leaned against the rough brick wall, the scent of garbage and grease filling his nostrils. This was the reality behind the restaurant's gleaming facade. He had given that place his creativity, his sweat, his respect for the craft. And in return, he'd been discarded like spoiled produce. He thought of the debt he'd taken on for culinary school, the second job he kept for a year just to afford his knives. He thought of his mother, who had worked double shifts so he could pursue this dream, her hands raw from cleaning other people's kitchens so her son could one day run his own. The shame burned hotter than any stove. How could he tell her? How could he explain that his talent, the thing she'd been so proud of, had been deemed worthless by a man who saw food as a spreadsheet? The back door swung open, flooding the alley with light and noise. One of the dishwashers, a kid named Miguel, stepped out holding a small cardboard box. Inside were Marcus's personal tools, his prized Japanese chef's knife, its blade honed to perfection, a few photos tucked beside it. "Chef," Miguel said, his voice hushed. "We all know. We know it wasn't you." He glanced back at the door nervously. "He's already on the phone, telling everyone. Says you're a hygiene risk. Says never to hire you." The words were a second firing, more devastating than the first. An industry blacklist. David wasn't just cutting him loose. He was burning the field behind him. Marcus took the box, his fingers numb. "Thank you, Miguel." He managed to say the words thick. Miguel nodded once, his expression a mix of fear and solidarity before slipping back inside. The door closed, plunging Marcus back into darkness. He was alone. The proof of his life's work fit into a single, sad box. The silence of the alley was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of a city that didn't care. He had been publicly dismantled, his reputation shredded with a casual, cruel lie. The path forward was a void. Have you ever faced a setback that felt like the end of everything? How'd you come back from it? Share your story below. Subscribe for the next chapter of resilience. The following weeks were a blur of silent desperation. The industry blacklist David Sterling had orchestrated was brutally effective. Marcus's resume, once a testament to his skill, now carried the invisible stain of David's lie. Every call went unanswered. Every application disappeared into a void. The polite rejections were the worst. "We've decided to go in a different direction," they'd say, the subtext screaming louder than the words. His savings, never substantial, evaporated. The rent on his small apartment became a monthly cliff edge. He took whatever work he could find, washing dishes in a noisy university cafeteria, hauling crates at a meatpacking plant. The work was brutal, mind-numbing, and a world away from the creative precision of a professional kitchen. His hands, once capable of crafting delicate emulsions, grew rough and calloused. The scent of garlic and herbs was replaced by the stench of bleach and raw meat. Each day was a lesson in humility that felt more like humiliation. It was in this fog of exhaustion that Elena found him. They had dated casually, a bright spot of warmth in his demanding life. She was a graphic designer with a sharp wit and a kindness that disarmed him. He had been too proud, too ashamed to call her after the firing. But she had heard the rumors, the whispered gossip about the chef fired for a hygiene violation. She showed up at his door one evening, holding a bag of groceries. She didn't ask for an explanation. She just started cooking a simple pasta in his bare kitchen, the familiar sounds and smells a painful reminder of the life he'd lost. Over dinner, he told her everything. The critic, the hair, David's cold fury, the blacklist. She listened, her hand covering his, her silence more comforting than any platitude. Their relationship became his anchor. In her, he found a reason to get up each morning. The hope was fragile, a tiny flame in a vast darkness. Then, 2 months into his exile, she told him she was pregnant. The news should have been a joy, but it landed with the force of a new terror. The fear in her eyes mirrored his own. How could they bring a child into this instability? His job prospects were non-existent. The future was a wall of impossibility. They spent a week in a state of quiet, shared panic, talking in circles about impossible solutions. Then, Elena made a decision. Her sister lived across the country, in a city with a thriving culinary scene untouched by David Sterling's influence. She had a spare room. It was a chance, she argued, a clean slate. "We can't stay here, Marcus," she said, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. "He's taken everything here. He can't follow us there." The word "we" was a lifeline, but it was also a confession of his failure. He couldn't provide for her here. He had to flee. The night before they left, he packed his few belongings. The last thing he placed in his bag was his chef's knife, still in its box from the alley. It felt like burying a part of himself. They took a bus, the city lights of his old life receding in the window, replaced by the anonymous darkness of the highway. He was not just moving. He was in exile, carrying the weight of a future he felt utterly unprepared for. Survival was no longer about pride. It was about the tiny, growing life that depended on his ability to start over from nothing. What's the hardest fresh start you've ever had to make? Share a fresh start in the comments if you've ever had to rebuild from zero. The story of redemption is just beginning. Subscribe for the journey. The new city was both a refuge and a prison. Elena's sister was kind, but the cramped apartment was a constant reminder of their precariousness. Elena, her pregnancy progressing, took a remote design job that paid little. Marcus's search began again, but the shadow of his unexplained departure from Sterling's followed him. He lowered his expectations, applying for line cook positions at diners and chain restaurants. The interviews were demeaning. Managers would look at his impressive resume and ask why he wanted to flip burgers. He couldn't tell the truth. He fabricated a story about needing a change of pace, his face burning with the lie. He finally found work at a noisy, chaotic pizzeria. The owner, a gruff man named Tony, didn't care about pedigrees. "Can you work hard and show up on time?" he grunted. Marcus nodded. The pay was a fraction of what he'd earned, the work relentless. But it was a paycheck. He came home, each night smelling of dough and tomato sauce, his body aching, his spirit frayed. Elena would be waiting, her belly growing rounder, her smile strained but steadfast. They were a team, fighting a silent war against despair. He missed the artistry of fine dining, the pursuit of perfection. Here, food was fuel, slapped together for customers who barely tasted it. It was a death of a dream, a slow suffocation of his talent. But every time he felt like giving up, he'd place his hand on Elena's stomach, feel the faint, miraculous kick of his son, and find the strength to go back to the pizzeria the next day. He was surviving, but a part of him was slowly dying, sacrificed to the brutal necessity of providing. The man who had created tea-smoked duck breast was now a ghost, haunting the body of a man who made pepperoni pizzas. The exile was not just geographical. It was a banishment from his own identity. Have you ever had to put your dreams on hold for someone you love? Comment sacrifice if you understand that kind of love. The 5-year jump is next. Subscribe to see how time changes everything. Back in the city Marcus had fled, David Sterling's empire did not just grow, it metastasized. The Sterling brand became synonymous with ruthless success, a monolith built on a foundation of cold, calculated moves. His engagement to Victoria Kensington was the crowning jewel in his corporate strategy, a merger that would blend old money with new, ruthless ambition. Their relationship was a transaction meticulously documented in society pages, a series of photo ops at galas and charity events where their smiles never reached their eyes. Victoria appreciated the security his wealth provided. David appreciated the legitimacy her name bestowed. They discussed prenuptial agreements over breakfast, their conversation as romantic as a board meeting agenda. In his sterile penthouse, surrounded by curated art and silent staff, David felt the familiar emptiness, a hollow space he kept trying to fill with bigger deals and grander acquisitions. The incident with the chef was a distant, inconsequential memory, a minor personnel decision he never revisited. He had won. That was all that mattered. 1,000 miles away, Marcus's life was a study in slow, painful rebirth. The first year in the new city was a blur of sleepless nights and desperate survival. Their son, James, was born under the fluorescent lights of a county hospital, a perfect, healthy boy whose arrival was both a miracle and a terror. The pizzeria job barely covered rent and diapers. Elena's remote work was sporadic. They existed in a state of constant, low-grade anxiety, passing the baby between them in their tiny apartment, their dreams reduced to the simple hope of a full night's sleep. Marcus's hands, once celebrated for their artistry, were now just tools for survival. The turning point was as small and quiet as their lives had become. A regular at the pizzeria, an older man who ran a struggling local bistro, noticed something in Marcus's efficient, graceful movements behind the counter. It was in the way he instinctively seasoned a sauce, the care he took arranging a simple side salad. "You're wasting your time here, kid," the man grunted one slow afternoon. He offered Marcus a trial shift in his real kitchen. It was a step down from Sterling's, a world away from the pizzeria. Marcus took it. He started as a line cook, but his talent was a light that couldn't be hidden. Within months, he was running the kitchen. He introduced subtle, refined dishes that honored the bistro's homey feel while elevating it. Word began to spread. The struggling bistro became a destination. Elena, seeing his confidence return, used her design skills to rebrand the place, creating a warm, inviting atmosphere that complemented his food. Their separate struggles began to merge into a shared purpose. They were no longer just surviving, they were building something together. Their partnership, forged in the fire of exile, became the bedrock of their lives. James grew from a baby into a bright, curious little boy in a home filled with the warm, delicious smells of his father's reclaimed passion. The silence in their small apartment was no longer filled with fear, but with the simple, happy sounds of a family. The ghost of David Sterling still lingered, a shadow in the corner of their success, but its power was fading with each passing day of their hard-won, authentic happiness. Can time truly heal all wounds? Or do some scars just change us? Share, heal, or change in the comments. The past is about to resurface. Subscribe for the reunion no one saw coming. 5 years of hard-won peace unraveled with the rustle of glossy paper. The society section of the newspaper, left on a cafe table, screamed the announcement in elegant, mocking typography. Sterling Kensington Union, a merger of dynasties. David's smug face smiled up from the page. Victoria's arm linked through his, a vision of cold, transactional perfection. The opulent wedding was scheduled for the following month. Marcus's hand trembled, sloshing coffee into the saucer. The past wasn't a shadow anymore. It was a fist punching through the fragile reality he'd built. The old wound, a dull ache he'd learned to ignore, tore open fresh, leaking the bitter poison of that public humiliation, the calculated destruction of his career, the desperate exile. He saw the kitchen, David's icy contempt, the alley, the box. He saw the fear in Elena's eyes when she told him she was pregnant, the terrifying bus ride into the unknown. David had built his empire on the rubble of Marcus's life, and now he was throwing a party to celebrate. That evening, James climbed into his lap, a children's book in hand. "Read, Daddy," he asked, his small face illuminated by trust. As Marcus read, his voice a practiced calm, James pointed to an illustration of a king in a castle. "Is that a bad king?" he asked. Marcus's breath caught. How does one explain to a 5-year-old that some people wield power not for good, but for cruelty? That the world has villains who face no consequences? He looked at his son, his bright, curious, innocent son, and a new, terrifying thought took root. James deserved to know that his father hadn't abandoned his dream. He deserved to understand that standing up to a bad king, even years later, was an act of integrity, not vengeance. The plan formed not from a place of anger, but from a profound need to close a chapter for the child who had been its unwitting result. He would show James the man who had tried to break him. He would show him that truth, no matter how delayed, has its own power. He found Elena in their small kitchen, the familiar, warm space a stark contrast to the cold opulence in the newspaper. He showed her the announcement. Her face paled. "Marcus, no," she whispered, the old fear flashing in her eyes. "We have a good life now. We're safe. Don't reopen this." He took her hands, his grip firm. "It's not about reopening a wound, Elena. It's about showing James that it's healed. I'm not the man he fired anymore. I need him to see that. I need our son to see that." He wasn't asking for permission. He was asking for her to understand the man he had become, a father first, a chef second, and a man no longer defined by another's cruelty. After a long silence, she squeezed his hands back, a silent, wary acknowledgement. The decision was made. They would attend, not as disruptors, but as witnesses. Marcus would wear the quiet confidence of a man who had built something real, and he would show his son that some castles are made of sand. Would you confront your past to teach your child a lesson in courage? Comment yes or a no below. The wedding crash is imminent. Subscribe to witness the moment of truth. The Sterling Kensington wedding was less a celebration and more a hostile takeover of a city block. A battalion of security coordinated via earpiece, their black suits a stark contrast to the absurdly white tent pavilion that sprawled across the closed-off park. Inside, the air was a perfumed cocktail of money and ambition, each floral arrangement costing more than most guests' monthly rent. The guest list was a who's who of corporate power, their conversations a low hum of deal-making and strategic flattery disguised as small talk. There were no childhood friends, no beloved aunts. Every face was a calculated addition to the social ledger. Victoria stood surrounded by her bridesmaids, a vision in hand-stitched ivory silk that felt more like corporate armor than a wedding gown. Her smile was practiced, her eyes constantly scanning the room, assessing the political landscape. This was her IPO, and her anxiety was a live wire, terrified a single misstep would cause a catastrophic drop in social valuation. Across the pavilion, David held court, the perfect picture of a man who had everything. He accepted handshakes and backslaps, his laugh a calibrated sound that never reached his eyes. He discussed the markets with one guest, the honeymoon itinerary with another, all while mentally reviewing the merger documents that would be signed the following Monday. The wedding was the final piece of branding before the acquisition closed. He saw the opulence not as beauty, but as a necessary display of strength, a signal to investors and competitors alike. The string quartet, the ice sculptures, the champagne fountain, it was all part of the prospectus. He felt a familiar, cold satisfaction. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The ceremony was choreographed with the precision of a military operation, every second accounted for, every emotion pre-approved. It was a flawless, empty performance, and he was its proud, hollow director. Have you ever been to a wedding that felt more like a business meeting? Share your cringe-worthy stories in the comments. The calm before the storm is over. Subscribe for the entrance that changes everything. The officiant's voice was a smooth, practiced monotone, weaving through the expensive air of the pavilion. David Sterling, do you take Victoria to be your lawfully wedded wife? The question hung, a formality awaiting its predetermined answer. David opened his mouth, the words "I do" a breath away from sealing his fate. Victoria's smile was a triumph of will over emotion, her eyes already calculating the social dividends of her new title. It was at that precise moment, as the two most powerful syllables of his life began to form, that the massive, ornate doors at the far end of the pavilion swung open with a force that silenced the quartet mid-cadence. The sound wasn't loud, but it was absolute. Every head turned in a synchronized swivel, a sea of privileged faces pivoting toward the interruption. The afternoon sun streamed through the doorway, backlighting a single figure. It wasn't a frantic, disheveled intruder. It was a man standing with a stillness that commanded the vast space. Marcus Chun. He was not the broken man David had fired. He stood taller, his shoulders squared in a well-tailored suit that spoke of quiet success, not desperate formality. The years had etched lines of resilience around his eyes, but his gaze was clear and direct, fixed on David with an intensity that bypassed the hundreds of guests and went straight to the billionaire's core. David's "I do" died in his throat. The air left his lungs. The cold, controlled mask he wore for the world slipped, revealing a flash of pure, unadulterated panic. His mind, usually a supercomputer of corporate strategy, short-circuited. This was impossible. This was a breach his security, his planning, his entire worldview could not account for. Victoria's triumphant smile vanished, replaced by a look of bewildered irritation. Who was this man, and why had he stopped her moment? Marcus didn't rush. He began to walk down the aisle, his steps measured and deliberate. The silence was heavier than any music, thick with the collective shock of the assembled elite. The guests watched, a gallery of mannequins, their champagne flutes frozen halfway to their lips. He didn't look left or right. His focus was absolute, a laser beam of purpose aimed at the man at the altar. The opulent flowers, the glittering chandeliers, the sea of designer clothes, it all faded into a meaningless blur. There was only the path forward and the reckoning at its end. He stopped a few feet from the altar, close enough for David to see the calm certainty in his eyes. The distance between them was more than physical. It was the chasm of 5 years, of a life destroyed and a life rebuilt. Marcus's voice, when he spoke, was not raised in anger. It was clear, calm, and carried to the very back of the pavilion with a quiet authority that demanded to be heard. "Hello, David," Marcus said, the simple greeting landing like a declaration of war. "You probably don't remember me, but I remember you." He paused, letting the weight of the past settle in the space between them. "You fired me 5 years ago today. You accused me of a lie to do it. You tried to destroy my career. You took a small step closer, his gaze unwavering. But you missed something. Something important. David found his voice, a strangled, cold sound he used to intimidate subordinates. Security, he barked, the word cutting through the silence. Remove this man immediately. This is a private event. But the security guards, who had been moving cautiously down the aisle, hesitated. There was something in Marcus's demeanor, a dignity that made their intervention feel crude, unjust. Marcus ignored the command. He turned slightly, not toward David, but toward the doorway. He raised his hand, a subtle gesture, and then a second figure stepped into the light. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old, dressed in a small, perfect suit. He had Marcus's gentle eyes, but his jawline, the set of his brow, it was unmistakably, devastatingly David's. The resemblance was so striking that a collective, audible gasp rippled through the crowd. The boy walked forward, his small hand slipping into Marcus's waiting one, his gaze fixed on the man at the altar with a child's unblinking curiosity. Marcus looked back at David, whose face had gone a ghostly white. "You didn't just fire a chef that day, David," Marcus said, his voice still calm, but now layered with a profound, unshakable truth. "You fired your son's father. This is James, your son." The sentence landed not as an accusation, but as a fact. It shattered the perfect, choreographed reality of the wedding into a million glittering pieces. The transaction was void. The merger was off. The future David had meticulously planned evaporated in the face of a 5-year-old boy with his own eyes. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and it was holding his son's hand. What would you do if your entire life was upended in a single moment? Comment shattered if you felt the impact of that revelation. The truth is just beginning to unfold. Subscribe for what happens next. The silence in the wedding pavilion was no longer just quiet. It was a physical presence, thick and suffocating. Marcus's words, "your son," hung in the air, a truth bomb that had vaporized the meticulously constructed reality of David Sterling's perfect day. David stood frozen at the altar, his face a pale mask of shock. The denial was there, a reflex honed by a lifetime of avoiding consequences, but it died before it could reach his lips. He stared at the boy, James, and saw not a stranger, but a living, breathing ghost. The shape of the child's face, the curve of his ear, the distinct sterling brow he saw in the mirror every morning. It was all there, an undeniable genetic echo. His mind raced, a frantic scramble through the timeline. 5 years, the firing, the sudden, clean break he'd made. It all aligned with terrifying precision. Victoria was the first to break. Her voice, when it came, was a sharp, brittle sound, stripped of all its cultured polish. "David? What is he talking about?" She turned from Marcus to David, her eyes wide with a dawning horror that was more social than emotional. This wasn't a personal betrayal yet. It was a catastrophic breach of protocol, a scandal that would be viral before the string quartet could pack their instruments. "Who is this man? Is this some joke?" David ignored her. His entire focus was on Marcus, the cold fury returning to his eyes, a defense mechanism against the tidal wave of panic. "This is a sick, pathetic lie," he spat, his voice regaining some of its corporate chill, though it trembled at the edges. "A desperate attempt at extortion. I'll have you arrested for trespassing and defamation." He gestured again, more violently this time, toward the security guards who were now flanking Marcus and James. "Get them out of here." But Marcus didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his hand tightening reassuringly around James's. He looked past David, addressing the room, the sea of stunned faces. "There's no lie here, David. Only a truth you chose to ignore." His gaze swept over the guests, many of whom were already discreetly filming on their phones. 5 years ago, you fired me from your restaurant based on a fabricated complaint. You told the industry I was a hygiene risk to ensure I'd never work again. You thought that was the end of the story. He looked down at James, his expression softening for a fraction of a second before returning its steady intensity to David. But it was just the beginning. My partner, Elena, was pregnant when you destroyed my career. We lost everything because of you. We had to leave the city to survive. He paused, letting the narrative sink in, allowing the guests to connect the dots. The cruel billionaire, the fired employee, the desperate flight. The story wrote itself. This isn't about money, Marcus continued, his voice gaining a harder edge. It was never about money. This is about you looking at your son. This is about you understanding that your actions have consequences that reach far beyond your balance sheets. You built an empire on the backs of people you viewed as disposable. Well, he said, his eyes locking with David's, meet one of the consequences. James, sensing the intense focus on him, shifted nervously but held his ground. He looked up at Marcus, then back at the pale, furious man at the altar. The child's innocence was a stark, devastating contrast to the adult drama swirling around him. He was the living proof, and his silent presence was more powerful than any document Marcus could have produced. The guests' murmurs, which had started as shocked whispers, now grew into an audible hum of scandalized excitement. The wedding was over. The show had begun. Victoria took a staggering step back, her hand flying to her throat as the full, humiliating implication crashed down on her. She wasn't just marrying a ruthless businessman. She was marrying a man who had abandoned his own child. The prenuptial agreement, the social standing, the entire carefully constructed future. It was all collapsing in the face of a 5-year-old boy's undeniable resemblance to his father. Is justice about revenge or about facing the truth? Comment justice or truth below. The backstory is even more shocking. Subscribe to hear what really happened that night. As Victoria's world crumbled into public humiliation, David's mind was dragged back to the night that had set this disaster in motion. The memory wasn't a hazy recollection. It was sharp and precise, a film he'd refused to watch for 5 years. He saw the kitchen, steam rising from pans, the frantic energy of a busy service. He saw Marcus at his station, a portrait of focused calm amidst the chaos. And he saw himself, a vulture circling, looking for a weakness. The food critic's complaint had been a gift, a perfect excuse to eliminate a talented employee whose quiet confidence he found threatening. The accusation about the hair had been so flimsy, so obviously planted, that its very absurdity was the point. It wasn't about proving Marcus was dirty. It was about demonstrating David's absolute power to dictate reality. He had never investigated. He hadn't questioned the busboy who suddenly quit the next day with a suspiciously large cash gift. He had simply delivered the verdict, enjoying the way the entire kitchen staff had shrunk under his gaze. He had told himself it was good business, cutting out a potential problem. But now, standing at the altar, exposed before the very society he sought to impress, he saw the deeper truth. It had been about fear. He had been afraid of Marcus's talent, afraid of the respect he commanded without demanding it, afraid of an integrity he could never possess. Firing him so brutally was an attempt to crush that unsettling feeling. And then came the deeper layer of betrayal, one he had orchestrated but never fully admitted to himself. The blacklist. After Marcus was gone, David hadn't been content. He had made calls to competitors, to suppliers, to anyone who would listen. He had subtly, persistently poisoned the well, ensuring Marcus's name was synonymous with failure and incompetence. He had systematically destroyed the man's ability to provide for his family. He had done it not for business, but for spite. He had wanted to erase Marcus Chun completely, to prove that David Sterling's was absolute. The final, most devastating piece of the memory clicked into place. A brief, frantic phone call from Marcus, a week or two after the firing. David had almost forgotten it. Marcus's voice, stripped of its usual calm, had been desperate. He tried to explain about Elena, about the pregnancy, about needing a reference, any reference to find work. David had cut him off. He'd coldly reiterated the fictional hygiene violation and hung up. He had heard the panic in Marcus's voice and felt a surge of satisfaction. He had them cornered. Now he understood the true cost of that cruelty. The pregnancy Marcus mentioned wasn't an abstract concept. It was the boy standing a few feet away, looking at him with his own eyes. David hadn't just fired an employee. He had tried to starve out his own child. The layers of his betrayal were now exposed for everyone to see, and the foundation of his carefully constructed life began to crack under the weight. Can a single cruel decision really destroy multiple lives? Share, yes, or IT depends in the comments. The confrontation reaches its peak next. Subscribe for the power inversion. David's gaze remained locked on the boy, James, but his mind was 1,000 miles and 5 years away, dragged back to the sterile confines of his office the day after the firing. The satisfaction of having eliminated a problem had been short-lived, replaced by a nagging need to ensure the problem stayed eliminated. He remembered the phone, cool and heavy in his hand. He hadn't called competitors directly. That would have been crude. Instead, he called a few trusted associates, men who owed him favors. Over expensive lunches, he'd lean back, swirling his wine, and offered a piece of career advice. That chin fellow, he'd say, his tone laced with false concern. Tremendous talent, of course, but a bit unreliable. Had to let him go over a serious hygiene issue. A real shame. I'd be cautious if his name ever crosses your desk. The message was received, understood, and disseminated through the industry's whispering network. He hadn't just fired Marcus. He had salted the earth behind him, ensuring nothing would ever grow there again. The memory shifted to a phone call a few weeks later. David had almost let it go to voicemail, the number unfamiliar. But something made him answer. It was Marcus. His voice was different, strained, stripped of the quiet dignity David hated. He was pleading, not for his job back, but for a simple letter of reference. Anything to get another position. He mentioned Elena. He mentioned the pregnancy, the word hanging in the air between them like a tangible weight. David had felt a cold thrill. This was better than he'd hoped. The desperation in Marcus's voice was a confirmation of his own power. He'd cut him off mid-sentence. "I've given my statement, Chun," he'd said, his voice flat and final. "The matter is closed. Do not contact me again." He'd hung up, the click of the receiver a period at the end of Marcus's sentence. He'd felt no guilt, only a sense of a job thoroughly completed. He had neutralized the threat and severed all lingering connections. Now, standing before the wreckage of his wedding, he saw the true cost of that phone call. The pregnancy wasn't an abstract hardship. It was the small, living boy whose hand was trustingly tucked into Marcus's. David had heard the fear in Marcus's voice, the fear of a man who could not provide for his unborn child, and he had weaponized it. He had knowingly pushed a pregnant woman and the man who loved her into a corner, forcing them to flee the city just to survive. The blacklist, the refused reference, they weren't just business decisions. They were acts of deliberate cruelty aimed at a family. The son he was now looking at had spent his first years in exile because David had wanted to prove a point. The layers of the betrayal were being peeled back, revealing not the shrewd businessman he pretended to be, but a man capable of a profound, calculated meanness. The foundation of his self-image, built on the idea of tough but fair leadership, crumbled into dust. He hadn't been strong. He had been monstrous. Have you ever discovered a hidden layer to a story you thought you knew? Comment layers below. The confrontation escalates next. Subscribe to see David's empire crumble. David's internal unraveling was mirrored by the physical scene unfolding before him. Victoria's initial horror had curdled into a cold, furious humiliation. She stepped away from him, putting physical distance between them as if he were contagious. "You lied to me," she hissed, her voice low but carrying in the dead silence. "You let me stand here with all these people." Her gesture took in the audience of their peers, whose phones were now openly recording the spectacle. "You're not just a liar, you're a fool." The contempt in her voice was a public execution. The merger was irrevocably broken. David tried to regain control, his training kicking in. Damage control. "Victoria, this is a calculated attack," he insisted, his voice tight. "This man is trying to extort me. Can't you see that?" He turned his anger back on Marcus. "What's your price, Chin? How much do you want to disappear? Name it." The offer hung in the air, a testament to David's belief that every problem had a financial solution. Marcus didn't even flinch. A sad, almost pitying smile touched his lips. "I told you, David. This isn't about money. I have my own restaurant now. A successful one. We build it ourselves, without crushing anyone." He looked at James, then back at David. The price was already paid. By him. He nodded toward his son. The price was 5 years without a father. You can't write a check for that. It was then that James, who had been silently observing, took a small, hesitant step forward. He let go of Marcus's hand and looked directly at David, his young face a mask of confusion. "Are you really my daddy?" he asked, his voice small but clear. The question, so simple and devastatingly honest, bypassed all the adult posturing and legal threats. It was a question from a child to the man who shared his face. David stared, his mouth slightly agape. The denial he'd been preparing died before it was born. The DNA tests, the documents, they were abstractions. But this child, this living, breathing piece of himself, was an undeniable fact. The power dynamic in the pavilion completely inverted. David, the billionaire, was powerless. Marcus, the fired chef, held all the cards: truth, integrity, and the moral authority of a father protecting his son. The guests watched, their sympathy visibly shifting. They weren't watching a disruption. They were watching a reckoning. David Sterling, the titan of industry, was being held accountable not by a board or a rival, but by the consequences of his own cruelty embodied in a 5-year-old boy. Who holds the real power in a confrontation? Wealth or truth? Comment wealth or truth below. The final collapse is next. Subscribe for the stunning conclusion. The silence that followed James's question was heavier than any verdict. David Sterling, a man who commanded boardrooms and moved markets, found himself utterly paralyzed by the simple inquiry of a child. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The carefully constructed defenses, the denials, the threats, the offers of money, crumbled to dust before the boy's unwavering gaze. James wasn't asking for proof or explanations. He was asking for a truth that was written on their shared faces. The physical resemblance, which had been a shocking revelation to the guests, was for David a horrifying confirmation. He saw his own childhood reflection in the boy's eyes, the same stubborn set to the jaw that his father had often chastised him for. This was no longer about Marcus Chun. This was about the undeniable biological fact standing 3 feet away. Victoria watched this silent exchange, and the last vestige of hope for salvaging the day evaporated from her eyes. She saw not a businessman under attack, but a man being unmasked. The cold calculation she had admired in him now seemed pathetic, a weak facade hiding a profound moral emptiness. She took a final, decisive step back, her movements sharp with disgust. "I'm done," she announced, her voice crisp and clear, carrying to every corner of the pavilion. "This wedding is off. The merger is terminated." She didn't look at David as she spoke. She addressed the guests, reclaiming her dignity by publicly severing the connection. With a glare that could freeze fire, she turned and walked briskly down the aisle, her bridesmaids scrambling after her like startled birds. The symbolic walk toward matrimony became a humiliating retreat, leaving David completely isolated at the altar. The power had not just shifted, it had inverted completely. David was no longer the aggrieved host dealing with an intruder. He was the accused, standing trial before a jury of his peers, with his own son as the star witness. Marcus watched Victoria's departure, then returned his calm gaze to David. "She understands consequences," he said quietly. "Something you've managed to avoid your entire life." He placed a protective hand on James's shoulder. "You try to buy silence, David. You try to threaten it into submission. But you can't purchase or intimidate the truth. It just is." David finally found his voice, but it was a hollow, broken thing. "What do you want from me?" he asked, the question a plea stripped of all its former authority. He wasn't negotiating anymore. He was begging for instructions on how to make the unbearable spectacle end. "I don't want anything from you," Marcus replied, his tone firm yet devoid of malice. "I wanted you to see. I wanted you to stand here in the middle of the perfect life you built by walking over other people, and meet one of the people you walked over. I wanted you to understand that your actions have weight, that people are not disposable assets. He looked down at James, his expression softening. And I wanted my son to see that standing up for the truth is more important than fearing powerful men. He then did something that shocked everyone. He turned his back on David. He knelt down, so he was eye level with James. "It's time to go, buddy," he said, his voice gentle. "We showed him what we came to show him." James nodded, his small hand slipping back into his father's. Without another word, without a glance back at the ruined wedding or the shattered billionaire, Marcus stood and began to walk back up the aisle, his son at his side. The crowd parted for them, a silent, respectful gesture. They weren't fleeing a scene. They were leaving a lesson behind. David was left standing alone at the altar, the opulent flowers and empty chairs a mocking monument to his downfall. The confrontation was over. Marcus had won not by destroying David, but by simply revealing the destruction David had already wrought upon himself. The power belonged to the man walking away with his integrity, and his son intact. Was Marcus's walk away a sign of strength or a missed opportunity? Comment strength or missed below. The aftermath of the scandal is next. Subscribe to see the empire crumble. The heavy silence left by Marcus and James's exit was a vacuum quickly filled by the chaotic energy of a collapsing empire. For a long, suspended moment, David Sterling remained at the altar, a statue of a man whose internal wiring had been severed. The guests, released from their stunned paralysis, erupted into a cacophony of frantic whispers and the frantic tapping of smartphone screens. The scandal was no longer a private drama. It was a live broadcast. Across the pavilion, David's senior board members, who had been watching with expressions of frozen horror, broke their formation. Phones were pulled from pockets, their screens illuminating faces that grew paler with each new alert. Sterling Holdings stock, already a subject of pre-merger speculation, was in freefall. The ticker symbol STERL was flashing red on every financial news channel, the plummeting numbers a real-time verdict on David's character. One of the board members, a man named Reynolds whose loyalty was directly proportional to the share price, shoved his phone toward David. "The stock is down 20% in 10 minutes. David, 20%. The analysts are calling it a governance crisis. We need a statement. Now." His voice was a harsh, panicked whisper, but it cut through the din. David didn't look at the screen. He was still staring at the empty space where his son had stood. The financial numbers, the one metric that had always defined his worth, felt abstract and meaningless. The cost was no longer measured in dollars, but in the trust he had seen in Marcus's eyes when he looked at his boy, a trust David had forfeited before it was even offered. Victoria's departure had been the first crack. Now the entire foundation gave way. A society columnist, emboldened by the chaos, approached David, her phone held up like a microphone. "Mr. Sterling, care to comment on the allegations? Is it true you knowingly abandoned your child?" David flinched as if struck. Before he could form a response, two of his largest investors brushed past him without a word, their faces set in stone, already dialing their private jets. The message was clear. They were cutting their losses. The wedding planner, a woman paid a fortune for perfection, was having a quiet but vehement argument with the catering manager, gesturing at the mountains of uneaten gourmet food. The opulent stage was now just a messy, expensive set for a tragedy. The carefully constructed reputation of David Sterling, built over decades of ruthless deals and calculated image-making, had taken less than an hour to disintegrate into dust and whispers. He was no longer a billionaire groom. He was the punchline to a scandalous joke, standing alone in the wreckage of a life that had been revealed as a beautiful, hollow fraud. Have you ever seen a public figure's reputation collapse in real time? Comment collapse below. The immediate consequences are devastating. Subscribe to see the full fallout. The digital tsunami hit before David had even left the pavilion. By the time his driver navigated the chaotic exit, his public relations team was in full-scale panic. His phone, silenced for the ceremony, now vibrated with the frantic energy of a trapped hornet. He ignored it, staring out the tinted window at a city that suddenly felt alien. But the news couldn't be ignored. On the car's entertainment screen, A financial news channel displayed a graphic of the Sterling Holdings ticker, a steep red arrow plunging downward. The cheering beneath screamed, "Sterling scandal. CEO accused of abandoning secret son at altar." The anchor's voice was a clinical monotone detailing the significant reputational damage and potential governance issues. It wasn't just gossip. It was a financial catastrophe unfolding in real time. His penthouse, usually a sanctuary of controlled silence, felt like a tomb. The first call he took was from Reynolds, the board member's voice stripped of its usual deference. "The board is convening an emergency meeting, David. Without you. Trading has been halted twice. The Kensington family lawyers have already served notice. They're suing for breach of contract. The prenup is void, and they're claiming damages for their reputational harm." The words were bullets. His engagement was not just broken, it was a legal battlefield. The second call was from his lead attorney, his voice grim. "We're being inundated with media requests. The story is everywhere." More concerning, David were getting calls. From former employees. From the restaurant. The attorney paused. They're corroborating Chen's story. The blacklisting. The fabricated complaint. It's not just a paternity issue anymore. It's a pattern of abusive business practices. Meanwhile, Marcus, Elena, and James slipped back into the quiet rhythm of their own lives. They returned to their restaurant, the humble table, which was buzzing with its usual evening warmth. The staff, their extended family, greeted them with knowing smiles and supportive pats on the back. The contrast was absolute. While David's world collapsed under the glare of 1,000 camera phones, Marcus's world grew stronger in the soft light of a successful dinner service. A regular customer, having seen the early news alerts, raised a glass to Marcus from across the room. It wasn't a gesture of pity, but of respect. The story wasn't a scandal here. It was a vindication. James, tucked into a corner booth with a coloring book, was the living proof that they had not just survived, but built something real and good. The consequences for David were a public unraveling. For Marcus, the consequence was the quiet, solid certainty that he had finally laid a 5-year-old ghost to rest. When a secret comes out, who suffers more? The one who kept it or the one it was kept from? Comment keeper or kept below. The rebuilding process begins next. Subscribe to see the new foundation. The following days in the Sterling Holdings headquarters were a masterclass in corporate triage. The board, in a desperate attempt to salvage shareholder value, forced David to take an indefinite leave of absence. A bland, carefully worded statement was issued, expressing deep personal regret for the disruption and committing to a thorough review of company culture, a transparent attempt to distance the corporation from its founder's personal disgrace. David's name was quietly removed from the letterhead. The empire he had built was now actively erasing him. He spent his days in the penthouse, a prisoner of his own making, watching the financial news dissect his downfall. The silence was deafening, broken only by the ping of notifications from lawyers and the distant hum of a city that had moved on. Across town, the humble table experienced an unexpected, though not unwelcome, surge. The story had turned Marcus and Elena into local symbols of resilience. The restaurant was packed nightly, not with gawkers, but with patrons who appreciated the integrity behind the food. The success was a quiet, organic thing, built on the quality of the experience, not the notoriety of the owner. One evening, as Marcus worked the line, the familiar, focused energy flowing through him, Elena approached. She placed a hand on his arm, a simple gesture that held the weight of their shared journey. James asked if he can have a little shelf in the office for his drawings, she said, a soft smile on her face. He says it's his restaurant, too. The request, so small and domestic, was the final brick in their new foundation. They weren't just running a business. They were building a legacy for their son, a legacy of honesty and hard work, built in the warm, noisy, real world of their own creation. Can a public scandal ever lead to a private redemption? Share yes or no in the comments. The empty victory is explored next. Subscribe for David's isolation. The silence in the penthouse was a physical weight. David stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the glittering city. The view, once a symbol of his dominion, now felt like a taunt. He was above it all and utterly alone in it. The victory he had spent a lifetime pursuing, the wealth, the power, the status, had been revealed as the emptiest of prizes. It provided no defense against the memory of James's face, no comfort from the ghost of Marcus's quiet dignity. He had spent years building walls to keep the world out, and now he was trapped inside them, a king in a castle of his own isolation. The phone rang, another call from a lawyer or a board member, another problem to be managed. He let go to voicemail. The problems felt trivial compared to the one problem he couldn't solve, the profound, echoing emptiness where a family should have been. The victory was his, and it was utterly worthless. What's the true cost of success built on others' suffering? Comment cost below. David faces his most difficult choice next. Subscribe for the redemption arc. The silence in David Sterling's penthouse was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence, heavy and accusing. The floor-to-ceiling windows that had once framed his kingdom now showed a city that had moved on without him. The board's indefinite leave of absence was a corporate euphemism for exile. His name was being scrubbed from the company he had built, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale in business journals. The financial freefall had stabilized, but at a devastating cost. A third of Sterling Holdings' value vaporized, his personal fortune halved. The calls had slowed from a frantic torrent to a trickle of final severances and legal formalities. He was rich, still obscenely so, but the money felt like ash in his hands. It could buy silence, but it couldn't purchase a single moment of peace. The ghost of James's face, the echo of Marcus's calm voice, were constants in the sterile air. He had spent a lifetime building an empire on a foundation of control and cold calculation, and in one afternoon, a 5-year-old boy had revealed it to be built on sand. Across the city, the humble table thrived in the warm, noisy reality David had always dismissed. The post-wedding notoriety had brought curious diners, but the food and the genuine warmth of the experience turned them into regulars. The success wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a steady, organic growth. Marcus and Elena worked side by side, their partnership deepened by the shared ordeal. One evening, as the last customers lingered over coffee, James tugged on his father's apron. "Papa, can I have a little shelf in the office? For my drawings?" he asked, his small face serious. "It's my restaurant, too." The request, so simple and full of belonging, struck Marcus with a profound sense of completion. This was the foundation they were building, not of wealth, but of a home. A place where their son felt he belonged, where his drawings were as important as the profit margins. Elena met Marcus's gaze over James's head, her smile a quiet testament to their hard-won peace. They were not just running a business. They were cultivating a life, and every satisfied customer, every happy employee, every drawing on a soon-to-be-installed shelf was a brick in that new, unshakable foundation. The contrast between the two worlds could not have been starker. David sat in his multi-million-dollar silence, the phantom taste of a wedding cake he never ate still bitter in his mouth. Marcus stood in the vibrant hum of his restaurant's kitchen, the scent of roasting garlic and his son's laughter filling the air. One man was surrounded by everything and had nothing. The other had built something from nothing and now had everything that mattered. The rebuilding was complete for one family, just as the great unraveling was settling into a permanent state of being for the other. The path forward for David was no longer about reclaiming what he lost, but about confronting the hollow man he had always been beneath the billionaire facade. Which foundation would you rather have? One built on wealth or one built on family? Comment, wealth or family below. David's moment of truth is next. Subscribe to see if he chooses redemption. The silence in David Sterling's penthouse had become a physical entity, a thick, suffocating presence that pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows. He stood before them, a spectator to a city that had already moved on. The indefinite leave of absence was a polite corporate death sentence. His name was being systematically erased from the company he had built, his legacy reduced to a footnote in a scandal. The financial bleeding had stopped, but the patient was a ghost. His fortune, though still vast, felt like counterfeit currency, able to purchase anything except the one thing he now understood had value: a moment's peace. The ghost of James's face was a constant companion in the sterile air. The boy's question, "Are you really my daddy?" echoed in the emptiness, a simple inquiry that had proven more destructive than any hostile takeover. He had spent a lifetime building an empire on a foundation of control, believing that every human interaction was a transaction to be won. Now he saw the truth. He had been building a beautiful, intricate cage, and he had successfully locked himself inside. The victory was his. He had the money, the property, the power, and it was all utterly, devastatingly worthless. The emptiness was not just around him. It was within him, a hollow core where a family should have been. He was a king standing alone in his castle, and the silence was the only subject left to rule. The silence in David Sterling's penthouse stretched for days, a living thing that fed on his regrets. His first impulse, honed by a lifetime of combat, was to fight back. He drafted furious emails to his lawyers, outlining a counteroffensive against Marcus Chun: defamation, emotional distress, parental alienation. He sketched out a PR campaign that would paint him as the victim of a sophisticated extortion plot. The old David Sterling would have unleashed hell, burying the truth under an avalanche of legal threats and media manipulation. But as he stared at the angry words on his screen, they felt hollow, the desperate flailing of a man who had already lost. The memory of James's face, not angry, not accusatory, but simply confused, rose up to meet his rage, and the fight drained out of him. What would he be fighting for? To return to this empty penthouse? To reclaim a corporate title from people who now saw him as a liability? The victory would be as meaningless as the silence. A different, more terrifying impulse began to take root. It started with a simple, inconvenient act. He looked up the address for the humble table. He didn't go. He just looked. He saw the photos online, the warm lighting, the crowded tables, the genuine smiles on the faces of the staff. He saw a review that mentioned the chef's young son sometimes helping to bus tables, a detail that felt like a punch to the gut. This was not the life of a man who had been destroyed. This was the life of a man who had been set free. The realization was a cold shock. His cruelty had not broken Marcus. It had, in a twisted way, forced him to build something authentic, something David had never possessed. The choice crystallized one rain-swept evening. He could double down, rebuild the walls higher, and live out his days as the lonely, bitter king of a ruined castle. Or he could do the one thing his entire life had trained him to avoid: surrender. Not to Marcus, but to the truth. He could choose the terrifying, humbling path of accountability. It would mean facing the shame, the ridicule, the financial consequences. It would mean admitting to himself and to the world that the great David Sterling was a fraud. But the alternative, a lifetime imprisoned by his own pride, was a far more terrifying prospect. The choice was no longer about winning or losing. It was about whether he had the courage to stop being the man he had become and try, however painfully, to become someone his son wouldn't be ashamed to call father. The path of redemption stretched before him, steep and narrow, and every instinct screamed to turn back. But for the first time, the echo of that silence was louder than the fear. When faced with your own mistakes, is it harder to double down or to admit you were wrong? Comment double down or admit below. The final dinner service holds the key. Subscribe for the circle to close. The decision, once made, felt less like a choice and more like a gravitational pull. David didn't call ahead. He knew any warning would give Marcus a chance to refuse him, and he needed to face the music in the arena where the truth held power. A week later, he found himself standing across the street from the humble table, watching the warm light spill from its windows onto the wet pavement. The buzz of conversation and clinking cutlery was a stark contrast to the sterile silence he'd left behind. He felt a profound sense of dislocation. This was not his world. He was an intruder here. Taking a deep breath, he crossed the street and pushed the door open. A wave of warmth and the rich, complex scent of braised meat and fresh herbs washed over him. The restaurant was full, every table occupied by people who looked happy, relaxed. For a moment, he stood unnoticed in the entryway, a ghost at the feast. Then, the hostess, a young woman with a genuine smile, greeted him. "Welcome to the humble table. Do you have a reservation?" The question was so normal, so devoid of the recognition and fear he was accustomed to, that it disarmed him completely. Before he could answer, he saw Marcus. He was at the pass, inspecting a plate before it went out, his focus absolute. He looked up, his gaze scanning the room, and it landed on David. There was no shock, no anger. His expression was unreadable, a calm mask that was more intimidating than any glare. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the hostess, who then turned back to David. "Right this way, sir. We have one spot left at the counter." He was led to a single stool at the end of the chef's counter, with a direct view into the kitchen. It felt like a deliberate placement, a seat in the witness box. He ordered the tasting menu, a silent acquiescence to whatever experience Marcus chose to give him. The meal that followed was the most excruciating and enlightening of his life. Each course was a masterpiece, a testament to the talent he had once dismissed as a nuisance. He watched Marcus work, calm, efficient, respected by his staff. There was no grand gesture, no confrontation. The meal was served with a quiet, professional dignity that was its own form of judgment. David was not a billionaire being served. He was a customer being nourished by the skill of a man he had tried to destroy. The circle had closed. He had come to this man's workplace years ago to deliver a death sentence. Now, he sat at his table, receiving a lesson in grace. When the final course was cleared, the check arrived. Tucked underneath, it was not a bill, but a simple, handwritten note. It read, "The meal is on the house. Some debts can't be paid with money." David looked up, but Marcus had already turned his back, his attention fully on the next order. The message was clear, acknowledgement, but not absolution. The circle was closed, but the path forward was still his alone to walk. Was Marcus's gesture a sign of forgiveness or a final statement? Comment forgiveness or statement below. The new normal begins. Subscribe for the final chapter. The seasons turned. In the warm, bustling heart of the humble table, a new normal settled in, rich and deep. James, now a year older, had his own small responsibilities, folding napkins, filling water glasses for favored regulars, his drawings proudly displayed on the office shelf he'd requested. His curiosity about the man at the wedding had softened into a child's abstract understanding of a complicated past, a story his parents handled with care but did not hide. The restaurant's success was no longer fueled by notoriety, but by reputation. It was a place known for exceptional food and a palpable sense of community, a testament to the family that had built it from the ground up. Marcus and Elena's partnership, forged in adversity, was the steady engine of it all. Their love was not a dramatic flame, but a constant, reliable warmth, evident in the easy way they moved around each other in the kitchen, a silent language of support and understanding. David Sterling's new normal was a quieter, more internal journey. He sold the penthouse, the silence having become unbearable. He moved into a smaller, simpler apartment, a physical shedding of the skin of his old life. The board, after a lengthy investigation, formally accepted his resignation. The public scandal faded from the headlines, replaced by newer dramas. He didn't try to re-enter his old world of deals and power lunches. Instead, he began the slow, unglamorous work of making amends. He reached out, through intermediaries, to former employees he had wronged, offering financial settlements with no strings attached. He donated anonymously to culinary scholarship funds. The actions were small, quiet, and done without any expectation of recognition. He was learning the difficult lesson that redemption was not a single grand gesture, but a daily commitment to being a different person than he was yesterday. He thought of James often, but he made no attempt to contact him. He understood that some bridges, once burned, could not be crossed. His role was not to force his way into the boy's life, but but to ensure the man he was becoming was someone who might, someday, be worthy of a second glance. The two realities existed in parallel, one of vibrant, noisy fulfillment, the other of quiet, purposeful atonement. Both were moving forward, but on paths that, for now, remain separate. Can people truly change, or do they just get better at hiding their true selves? Comment change or hiding below. The final lesson is revealed next. Subscribe for the powerful conclusion. 5 years to the day after the wedding that never was, David found himself walking through a public park, a place he would have once considered beneath him. He watched families, real families, having picnics, flying kites, their lives intertwined in a way his never had been. He saw a father lift his son onto his shoulders, the boy shrieking with laughter, and the image struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a snapshot of the life he had forfeited, not just with James, but with every person he had ever treated as a means to an end. The lesson was no longer an abstract concept. It was a visceral ache. The weight of his actions was not measured in lost billions or a ruined reputation. It was measured in the countless moments of simple human connection he had sacrificed on the altar of his ambition. A kind word never spoken, a hand never extended, a child's laughter never heard because he was too busy building walls. He had believed people were disposable, and in doing so, he had made his own humanity disposable. The true cost was the life he had never lived. The quiet satisfaction of a job well done, the warmth of a shared meal with people who loved you, the profound purpose of guiding a child through the world. These were the currencies of a rich life, and he had bankrupted himself pursuing worthless coin. Marcus had not just sought justice that day at the altar. He had held up a mirror. The reflection showed David that his cruelty had not been strength, but a profound weakness, a fear of anything genuine he could not control. The lesson was that every action, every dismissal, every cruel word had a weight that accumulated over a lifetime. And in the end, the only thing that mattered was the weight of the good you carried, not the empire you left behind. The ghost of James's face would always be with him, not as a punishment, but as a permanent reminder of the man he had failed to be and the man he was still, painstakingly, learning to become. What's the most important lesson about power and responsibility you've learned? Share it in the comments. The final, powerful conclusion is next. Subscribe to witness the last scene. The dinner rush at the humble table was winding down. The clatter of the kitchen was softening into a contented hum. Marcus stood at the pass, wiping down the stainless steel, a faint smile on his face as he watched the scene in the dining room. Elena was laughing with a table of regulars, her ease a testament to the life they had built. And there, in his favorite booth, was James, now 10 years old, his head bent over a homework assignment, a half-eaten plate of fries beside him. He was safe. He was loved. He was home. This noisy, warm, imperfect reality was the only truth that mattered. Later, as they walked home through the quiet streets, the three of them together, Marcus felt Elena's hand slip into his. James ran a few steps ahead, chasing a stray leaf in the lamplight. Marcus didn't think about David Sterling anymore. The man belonged to a past that no longer had any hold on him. The confrontation, the scandal, the pain, it had all been the difficult, necessary soil from which this life had grown. The truth had not just set him free, it had given him everything. The only truth that mattered was right here. The weight of his son's backpack as he carried it for him, the sound of his wife's laughter, the quiet certainty of a future built on integrity. They turned the corner, a small family unit, their shadows merging into one under the streetlights, moving forward into a night full of peace. This story shows that truth and family are the ultimate wealth. What did this story mean to you? Let us know in the comments. For more powerful tales of redemption, subscribe and turn on notifications for our next story. The decision, once made, felt less like a choice and more like a gravitational pull toward a truth he could no longer outrun. David Sterling stood across the rain-slick street from the humble table, watching the warm, golden light spill from its windows. The sound of laughter and clinking glassware filtered through the closed door, a stark contrast to the hollow silence of his own existence. He felt like a ghost haunting the edges of a life he had once tried to extinguish. For a man who had always made grand entrances, this felt like the loneliest approach he would ever make. He wasn't here to demand or explain. He was here to witness, to finally see with his own eyes what his actions had created in their aftermath. Taking a breath that did nothing to steady him, he crossed the street and pushed the door open. A wave of warmth and the rich, complex aroma of braised short ribs and fresh rosemary washed over him. The space was alive, every table occupied by people lost in conversation, their faces illuminated by the gentle glow of pendant lights. For a moment, he stood in the entryway, utterly invisible. Then, a young hostess with a genuine, unforced smile approached. "Welcome to the humble table. Do you have a reservation?" The question was so ordinary, so devoid of the recognition and deference he was conditioned to expect, that it disarmed him completely. He was just another customer. Before he could answer, he saw him. Marcus Chun stood at the kitchen pass, his focus absolute as he inspected a perfectly seared scallop before nodding to a server. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the dining room before it landed on David. There was no visible shock, no flash of anger. His expression remained an unreadable calm, a placid lake that revealed nothing of its depths. It was more intimidating than any glare. Marcus gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the hostess, a silent communication that bypassed David entirely. "Right this way, sir," the hostess said, her smile never fading. "We have one spot left at the counter." He was led to a single stool at the very end of the chef's counter, a seat that offered a direct, uninterrupted view into the heart of the kitchen. It felt like a deliberate placement, a chair in the witness box. He ordered the tasting menu, a silent surrender to whatever experience Marcus chose to give him. The meal that followed was the most excruciating and profound of his life. Each course was a masterpiece of flavor and technique, a brutal reminder of the immense talent he had so casually dismissed. He watched Marcus work, not with the tyrannical fury of a celebrity chef, but with a calm, confident authority that commanded deep respect from his team. There were no shouted orders, only quiet commands and seamless coordination. This was not a man who had been destroyed. This was a man who had been refined by fire. The eighth course arrived, a delicate chocolate torte with a salted caramel center that dissolved on the tongue. As the plate was set before him, David finally caught Marcus's eye. He held his gaze for a brief second, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. It was a simple, devastating recognition that the past existed. When the final course was cleared, the check arrived. Tucked neatly under the leather folio was not a bill, but a single, handwritten note on a simple piece of kitchen parchment. The script was clean and precise. It read, "The meal is on the house. Some debts can't be paid with money." David looked up, seeking Marcus, but the chef had already turned his back, his attention fully consumed by the next ticket. The message was delivered. The circle, after 5 long years, was finally closed. Acknowledgement had been given, but absolution remained a distant, unclaimed country. David Sterling sat alone at the counter, the weight of the free meal heavier than any check he had ever paid. What do you think David's next move should be after receiving that note? Comment, leave them alone, or keep trying below. The path to a new normal starts next. Subscribe to see if peace is possible. The seasons turned, each one layering a new kind of quiet over David Sterling's life. The frantic, panicked quiet of the scandal's immediate aftermath had given way to a deeper, more permanent stillness. He sold the penthouse, the transaction as cold and efficient as all his business dealings had once been. The new apartment was smaller, the view less spectacular, the silence just as profound. The board had formally accepted his resignation after their internal review, a document that carefully cataloged his managerial missteps without ever mentioning a wife, a child, or a wedding. He was a ghost in the machine he had built, his name a piece of historical data in the corporate archives. He didn't fight it. The fight had gone out of him. replaced by a weary acceptance. His days were no longer measured in deals closed or stocks acquired, but in the small, anonymous acts of atonement he could manage. A significant, no-strings-attached donation to a culinary arts fund for underprivileged youth. A generous settlement, delivered through a third-party lawyer, to a former maitre d' he had publicly berated into quitting a decade ago. The actions were quiet, unseen, and brought him no peace. But they felt like the only honest work left for him to do. He thought of James every day, the boy's face a permanent fixture in his mind, but he never once picked up the phone. He understood his role was not to disrupt their peace, but to ensure the man he was slowly, painfully becoming was someone who wouldn't deserve to be turned away. At the humble table, the new normal was a vibrant tapestry of noise and connection. The restaurant's success was a settled fact, its reputation built on a foundation of excellence that had long outlived the fleeting notoriety of the wedding. James, now thriving, was a constant presence after school, his designated shelf in the office overflowing with drawings and school projects. He was growing into himself, his curiosity about the past evolving into a quiet understanding that his family's strength was their greatest possession. One evening, as Marcus wiped down the grill, the familiar scent of seared meat and cleaning solvent in the air, he watched Elena laugh with a table of regulars. Her ease, her lightness, was the ultimate testament to the life they had built from the ashes of his firing. Their partnership, forged in struggle, had settled into a deep, unshakable rhythm. They weren't just business partners or co-parents. They were the steady center of a small, warm universe they had created together. The two realities, David's quiet atonement and the Chun family's vibrant fulfillment, existed in the same city, on the same timeline, but worlds apart. One man was learning the weight of his actions in solitude. The other family was living the truth that the only wealth that mattered was the love they shared within the four walls of their crowded, noisy, perfect restaurant. Can two such different paths both lead to a form of peace? Share yes or a no in the comments. The final lesson about the weight of actions is revealed next. Subscribe for the powerful conclusion. 5 years to the day after the wedding that never was, David found himself walking through a public park, a place he would have once considered beneath his station. He watched families having picnics, flying kites, their lives intertwined in a way his never had been. He saw a father lift his son onto his shoulders, the boy shrieking with laughter, and the image struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a snapshot of the life he had forfeited, not just with James, but with every person he had ever treated as a means to an end. The lesson was no longer an abstract concept. It was a visceral ache. The weight of his actions was not measured in lost billions or a ruined reputation. It was measured in the countless moments of simple human connection he had sacrificed on the altar of his ambition. A kind word never spoken, a hand never extended, a child's laughter never heard because he was too busy building walls. He had believed people were disposable, and in doing so, he had made his own humanity disposable. The true cost was the life he had never lived. The quiet satisfaction of a job well done, the warmth of a shared meal with people who loved you, the profound purpose of guiding a child through the world. These were the currencies of a rich life, and he had bankrupted himself pursuing worthless coin. Marcus had not just sought justice that day at the altar. He had held up a mirror. The reflection showed David that his cruelty had not been strength, but a profound weakness, a fear of anything genuine he could not control. The lesson was that every action, every dismissal, every cruel word had a weight that accumulated over a lifetime. And in the end, the only thing that mattered was the weight of the good you carried, not the empire you left behind. The ghost of James's face would always be with him, not as a punishment, but as a permanent reminder of the man he had failed to be and the man he was still, painstakingly, learning to become. What's the heaviest weight you've carried from a past action? Share your experience in the comments. The final truth is revealed next. Subscribe for the powerful conclusion. The dinner rush at the humble table was winding down into its familiar, contented hum. Marcus stood at the pass, wiping down the stainless steel, his gaze drifting to the dining room where Elena laughed with their regulars. And there, in his favorite booth, was James, now 10 years old, his head bent over homework with a half-eaten plate of fries beside him. He was safe. He was loved. He was home. This noisy, warm, imperfect reality was the only truth that mattered. Later, as they walked home through the quiet streets, the three of them together, Marcus felt Elena's hand slip into his. James ran ahead, chasing a stray leaf in the lamplight. The confrontation, the scandal, the pain, it had all been the difficult soil from which this life had grown. The truth had not just set him free, it had given him everything. The only truth that mattered was right here. The weight of his son's backpack as he carried it, the sound of his wife's laughter, the quiet certainty of a future built on integrity. This story shows that truth and family are the ultimate wealth. What did this story mean to you? Let us know in the comments. For more powerful tales of redemption, subscribe and turn on notifications for our next story.